My name is Daniel, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have said I had a wonderful marriage. I believed in us and thought we were solid. For the past 5 years, my primary concentration has been on developing our future. My business was finally taking off, and I was expanding into new cities. This entailed a lot of travel, days or weeks at a time. But I did it for us. I figured it was worth it. But life has a strange way of knocking you down on your back, just when you thought everything was going to plan. The day my world came apart, the truth appeared to me on its own, and when it did, it impacted me harder than I ever imagined. I was away on a trip, which has been going well. Business meetings were productive, transactions were being concluded, and I was already considering returning home to spend time with my lovely wife. I was fatigued but satisfied, knowing that every hard hour I put into this business was contributing to a brighter future. Then my phone rang in the afternoon. It was Mark, a longtime buddy, but his voice was different, hesitant and apprehensive. But as he spoke, everything changed. Daniel, listen, I wasn't sure if I should call you, but I can't keep this to myself. Sophia and another man were just leaving a hotel, and I caught a brief glimpse of them. I said nothing. My mind fought to comprehend what I'd just heard. Perhaps I misheard him. Maybe there was a mistake. But Mark was not the sort to make light of such a situation. I took photographs, Daniel. I wasn't sure whether I should, but I had a nasty feeling. I'll send them to you now. My phone vibrated a bit later. When I opened the message, my fingers felt rigid. Sophia, my wife, walked out of a hotel lobby. She was not alone. A guy was close near her. I still did not react. I did not call to yell at her. I simply stood there, staring at the sights on my screen. The reality was staring me in the face, but I still wanted to believe there was another answer. Danny. There. Mark's voice drew me back. Yeah. I'm here, I responded, trying to seem calm. Man, I did not want to be the one to tell you this, but you needed to know. I nodded to myself, but he couldn't see me. I was not irritated with Mark. If anything, I felt grateful. He didn't know this, but he did it anyhow. And deep inside, I knew he was correct. I needed to know. But now that I had it, what the heck was I going to do with it? I arrived back earlier than expected. I didn't call beforehand or text. I just walked through the front door. Sophia was in the kitchen, humming quietly and chopping veggies. She turned, saw me, and grinned. How was your trip? Her voice sounded light. I urged myself to be calm. I gave her a nod, and like everything was fine. I answered her nonchalantly and watched her wander about the kitchen. I let her talk, waiting for the appropriate moment. Then, when she least expected it, I said something. Unlock your phone. The room went silent. The air became dense. Unspoken tension pervades the situation. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered and managed a tiny laugh. What? Why? She attempted to make it sound lighthearted, but I noticed how her fingers trembled. I didn't respond. I just gazed at her and waited, watching. She shakes her head. Daniel. Come on. This is ridiculous. Unlock it. My voice remained calm and steady. There is no rage, only a desire. She crossed her arms and let out another shaky laugh. You don't trust me after all this time? I did not argue. I reached over, grabbed her phone, and held it up between us. Her face had lost its color. Unlock it now, or I vow I'll walk out that door and never look back. She remained motionless for a moment. She stared at me, looking for an escape. But there wasn't one. She knew it. I knew it. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone from me, her fingertips hesitantly moving across the screen. She finally gave in. The lock screen disappeared. The first thing I saw was a stream of unread texts, some from a saved contact, and others from an unknown number. I clicked one after the other. Everything was there. Explicit writings, images, and videos. Things I never dreamed my wife would email to another man. The heartbreaking aspect is that my wife occasionally sends me photographs of herself. Some of them specifically remind me of what I have at home. I discovered she had also forwarded them to another man. I read through hotel reservations, late-night talks, and texts about getting together when I was abroad working. Detailed discussions about me. How she thought I was too preoccupied with my business to notice anything. How could she do whatever she wanted since I trusted her too much? The words blurred for a second, but I continued reading. I sat down because I needed to see everything to fully understand who she was. When I was not looking, Sophia sank into the couch, sobbing and gripping her face, as if the guilt had become unbearable. I'm sorry I felt lonely. You're never home, Daniel. I'm just saying. Her words came out in gasps, interrupted by weeping. I did not intend for that to happen. I love you. Please let me clarify. But I didn't react as she expected. Without saying anything, I took screenshots and copied the files to myself. Then, as calmly as I had requested her to unlock the phone, I placed it back on the table. I answered her weeping look with a colder voice than I'd ever heard. I do not need to hear your excuses. Then I stood up, walked past her quivering form, into our bedroom, and began packing some of the items I hadn't brought with me on the previous trip. My clothes and paperwork. Everything is vital. Everything the first needed was to go out that door without looking back. I relocated into a temporary residence, banned her phone number, and cut off all communication. If she had something to say, she may convey it through my lawyer. I quickly called my lawyer to file for divorce. And that was the distinction between us. She acted impulsively, motivated by greed and irresponsibility. I acted with purpose and clarity. Everything was addressed via legal methods. I refused to sit across from her in a meeting and pretend there was anything left to discuss. My lawyer was straightforward. There will be no mediation, no prolonged emotional manipulation, and no useless conversations. Simply a clean break. And for the first time in months, I felt able to breathe. The ache did not disappear overnight. I didn't wake up the next morning feeling liberated from everything I'd just lost. But I did have a choice: sit in my unhappiness or make it into something helpful. I selected the latter. I focused relentlessly on my business. I had planned an enlargement. I made it happen. And I did it quickly. I didn't just move cities. I completely rebranded my life. The weight of what had happened eased with each passing day. I wasn't getting better because of time. I was healing because I chose to. Months had gone, and I looked in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the man staring back at me. Stronger, smarter, wealthier. By then, the divorce was practically complete. It took a long time, because she expected more than I was willing to provide. And the best part? I had no feelings for her anymore. There's no anger, despair, or love. Just indifferent. Indifference, my friends, is the most effective form of vengeance. After months of silence, rebuilding my life from the ground up in another city, and finally learning to breathe without the weight of betrayal on my chest, she returned. It was late. It's well past dinner time. I had just finished work. I'm looking forward to a hot shower and some sleep. When I heard a knock on the door, I didn't expect anyone. For a split second, I pondered ignoring it, but something inside me told me to check. So I opened the door, and there she was, Sophia. She stood there in the dim porch light, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, tears streaming down her face. But that wasn't what threw me off. For a few seconds, it was her stomach, round and heavy as if pregnant. Neither of us spoke. I merely gazed, thoughts blank and body stiff. She then broke down in cries and hiccups. She said she had made a mistake. She'd spent months weeping herself to sleep. Guilt haunts me. You're missing me. She wishes she could take it back. She said she would never stop loving me. She was so lonely and bewildered that loneliness drove her to make terrible decisions. And then comes the ultimate blow. Daniel, this is your baby. She stated that like a lifeline, as if she actually hoped those remarks would entice me back to her. She wanted another opportunity. She wanted us to be a family again. She pledged to be faithful this time around, that she'd changed. I stood there listening and watching, and for a tiny moment, I felt sad for her. But then I remembered why she was standing here in the first place. She wasn't present because she loved me. She was not present because she regretted hurting me. She came here because she needed something. I let her continue. Allow her to spill forth every apology and promise. Every perfectly constructed line was intended to yank on my heartstrings. When she eventually stopped looking up at me with hopeful, weeping eyes, I simply nodded and said, "Okay, let's get a DNA test." Her entire expression shifted the moment I said those words. The weeping ceased. The panic had set in. What? She gave a hesitant laugh and shook her head. Daniel, how could you possibly ask me that? Do you think I'd lie about something like this? I didn't respond. I just gazed at her and waited. She kept rambling, accusing me of cruelty, and claiming I was punishing her for the past. That I should trust her. I'd always trusted her before. That request for a test was an insult and an attack. Proof that I never truly loved her in the first place. And right there, I knew I could see straight through her. If she had nothing to hide, she wouldn't be so terrified. If she was confident this was my child, she would have agreed instantly. However, she didn't. She battled it. I took a big breath, stepped back, and placed my hand on the door. If you refuse to take the test, I said with a calm voice, I've got nothing to say to you. Then, without waiting for another word, I shut the door in her face. I believed I had witnessed the worst of Sophia's dishonesty, but I was mistaken. Months after I had sent her away, and made it apparent that I had no interest in her or her alleged pregnancy, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Go even further. I was unexpectedly served with a lawsuit. She was bringing me to court, saying that I had abandoned my child, for whom she had refused to undergo a DNA test. The irony was not lost on me. Sophia portrayed herself as the ultimate victim. She told the court how I had brutally abandoned her when she needed me the most, refusing to accept responsibility and leaving her to suffer. It was a well-written sob story. I will offer her that. She cried. She sniffled, and she played her role brilliantly for someone who didn't know better. She resembled a lady who had been betrayed, who had loved too much and been abandoned by the guy she trusted. However, there was one difficulty. She was lying. What she didn't comprehend was that I was no longer the man she had previously exploited. I had the funds, resources, and, most importantly, the determination to fight back. So I did exactly what any man in my position would do. I hired the city's best lawyers. These weren't ordinary lawyers. These were professionals who had made their livelihoods by tearing apart manipulative spouses in court. Sophia, too. She was just another case to them. The trial was terrible. My legal team quickly dismantled her entire case. They presented every piece of evidence, including her affairs, reluctance to take the DNA test, and obvious attempts at extortion. They revealed how she had attempted to manipulate the court system by bending the narrative to make herself appear like the victim, when, in fact, she was the one who ruined our marriage. Every untruth she told was met with hard facts. Every dramatic performance was met with indisputable truths. By the time my lawyers finished, there was no mistake who Sophia truly was. The courtroom, which had before been filled with sympathetic comments about the abandoned pregnant woman, was now filled with hushed muttering about her deception. She had no defense, no means to explain her conduct. She came to court intending to ruin me, but she ended up ruining herself. The judge didn't simply rule in my favor. He took a step further. A cease and desist order was obtained against her, prohibiting her from contacting me in any way after losing publicly. There was no going back from this. As I walked out of the courtroom, I reflected on how much I had once pitied her. When she arrived at my door, yearning for another opportunity. But after everything she had done, after all the lies, deception, and the sheer chutzpah to sue me over a child she couldn't even verify was mine, I was just thankful I didn't let her back into my life. Finally, I learned one thing from this entire ordeal. Never let guilt or deception cause you to question your worth. When someone shows you who they are, trust them. I ignored the warning indications. I trusted blindly and paid the consequences. However, when I eventually walked away, I did not glance back, and it was the best decision I've ever made. If you ever find yourself in a position where someone is attempting to guilt trip you, manipulate you, or make you feel guilty for their mistakes, stand your ground, protect yourself, because some individuals never come back from love. They return out of desperation, and if you allow them in, they will ruin you all over again. But what do you all think? If you were in my shoes, would you have handled it the same way? Do you think I should have given her another chance? Here's the next story. Darkness covered the tiny lane behind a decrepit motel on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Police sirens sounded in the distance. Their harsh echoes reverberated off the concrete walls and mixed with the sound of heavy rain. Daniel stood there, soaked, frightened, and wide-eyed at the still person on the ground. His clothing was damaged. There was a streak of blood on his cheek, and his heart hammered as if it was trying to escape from his chest. The neon sign of a nearby liquor store flashed sporadically, illuminating the landscape in brief, confusing flashes of red and white. He gulped for air and mumbled incoherently, attempting to recall how things had gotten to this point. He continued saying, beneath his frantic breaths, that he never imagined life could spiral so quickly. Amidst the rain and sirens, he dropped on his knees. There was no telling if the figure beside him was still alive. A strangled shriek from his lips, and the night swallowed any sense of security. It had started innocently enough, with Daniel waking up in the bedroom of a modest two-story house in a Los Angeles suburb near Venice Beach a few weeks before. The morning sunlight had crept through the delicate drapes, exposing a clean, well-furnished chamber. A beautiful framed image of Daniel and his wife Rebecca on their wedding day hung on the dresser, depicting a moment when everything between them felt magical and full of hope. On the surface, they had the traditional American dream, a suburban home, 2 cars in the driveway, steady employment, and the occasional cookout with neighbors on the weekends. But cracks began to appear in that bright exterior, and their once passionate marriage had devolved into a routine that felt more like polite cohabitation. Even their chats had lost their freshness, resulting in boring exchanges about grocery lists, housework, and dinner arrangements. Daniel had left for work early that morning, running behind schedule as usual. He worked as an attorney at a reputable downtown company, juggling a number of issues that left him exhausted on a daily basis. He hugged Rebecca in passing, a quick, mechanical move that conveyed little emotion. She had smiled back, but her eyes were distant. After he drove away, she looked at the tire marks on the asphalt, feeling a tinge of disappointment. He once said that their love was unstoppable, like a never-ending road trip. But now the metaphor became sarcastic. Their house was on a normal suburban street, with manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. But underlying that regularity lay the stress that had silently crept into their lives. That same afternoon, Rebecca was dusting the living room bookcases while looking through an old photo album. She noticed photos of Daniel from his undergraduate years. His huge grin illuminated the frame. There was also an image of him with his younger brother, Michael. Michael's stare was brazen during a family reunion on July 4th. His posture exuded confidence, and the two brothers were close enough to be considered best friends. It struck her as strange that they hadn't seen Michael in almost a year. She remembered how he had always been a little more daring than Daniel, someone who acted on instinct rather than following a schedule. Rebecca closed the album and decided to set those thoughts aside. Returning to her usual routine of laundry and cleaning, she couldn't figure out why Michael's memory made her heart skip a beat. Perhaps it reminded her of how life used to be when she was younger, and less bogged down by routine. Daniel came from work that evening feeling considerably more fatigued than normal. He mumbled hello, gave Rebecca a short kiss on the cheek, and headed directly to his home office. He had a huge case that was about to be settled, and he didn't have time to talk about anything else. Rebecca attempted to engage him in discussion about his impending weekend plans, such as a trip to the Santa Monica Pier or an evening walk on the beach. But he just reacted with indistinct grunts. She made dinner for two, but Daniel remained engrossed in his computer, barely noting the aroma of fresh pasta wafting from the kitchen when he finally emerged. It was late, and Rebecca had already eaten. She sighed and retreated to the bedroom, feeling a faint ache of rejection. She lay completely awake, staring at the ceiling fan, which rotated slowly. They previously shared this area with lighthearted banter and sleepy hugs. But now, the bedroom has become a silent battleground. Daniel would slip under the covers and fall asleep instantly, while she would toss and turn, her thoughts churning with unfulfilled wants and longing for a flame that appeared to be gone. The next morning, they both continued in the same mechanical manner. The underlying tension persisted, and neither had the confidence to acknowledge it. A few days later, just as Rebecca was about to lose herself in a cloud of habit, her phone rang. She responded, only to hear Michael's familiar voice. Casual, but with an undercurrent of something unspoken. He stated he was heading to Los Angeles for personal reasons and hoped they could catch up. His tone was nice enough, but Rebecca detected the old aggressiveness that had distinguished Michael throughout his life. She asked him to stay in their place, saying it would be foolish of him to pay for a hotel. Part of her was simply being polite. Another part, hiding deeper, longed to see him. Daniel was astonished when he learned the news. He hadn't communicated with Michael in months and had no idea what he was up to. There was some vague chatter in the family about Michael being involved in dangerous financial transactions and potentially having run-ins with shady friends. Daniel had always rejected the rumors as exaggerated. He was pleased that his brother would pay him a visit. Though he couldn't deny the tinge of dread gnawing at him, images of their youth flashed through his head. Michael was the rebellious one, whereas Daniel had always been the dutiful older brother. Despite their differences, they had previously shared a deep friendship. Now that they were grown-ups, their paths had diverged dramatically. Still, the prospect of seeing him after a lengthy absence felt strangely comfortable, like a reminiscence of a simpler time. Michael arrived on a Friday evening in a nice rental car, dressed in a stylish leather jacket and slacks that were a little too new for someone reportedly struggling financially. He projected nonchalant confidence as he hugged Rebecca, and then Daniel, patting his brother on the back. They discussed the traffic on the 405, typical complaints about Los Angeles freeways, as well as a few smog-related jokes. Rebecca led him to the guest room, where he dropped one suitcase. Daniel observed his brother's gaze darting throughout the house, soaking up every detail from the furniture to the portraits on the walls. It looked as if Michael was evaluating more than simply the decor. They sat down to a quiet dinner. Rebecca had prepared. The topic ranged from ancient family memories to places Michael had been across the country. He apparently drove through Arizona and Nevada on his way here, claiming he was taking care of some family business. Daniel was too fatigued to investigate the details. Instead, he was pleased to see his wife actively involved with his brother. The two seemed to have an easy chat. Their laughs punctuated the meal. Rebecca felt a faint flare of warmth as Michael focused on her. He inquired about her day, hobbies, and the local yoga class she visited. He complimented her cuisine, hair, and table settings. In short, all the small signs of affection. Daniel hardly sent her anything lately. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to his bedroom to check some case files, Rebecca and Michael lingered in the living room, sipping coffee. The light from a little bulb illuminated Michael's features, reminding her of how confident he always appeared. She felt a faint flutter of exhilaration in her chest, a guilty feeling she tried to ignore. She told herself she was just glad to have decent company, especially from a familiar person who inquired how she was doing. She informed Michael about how dull her life had become, and how Daniel was too preoccupied with work to notice her. Michael listened closely, nodding in sympathy without passing judgment. When they eventually said goodnight, she realized she had been smiling the majority of the time. Michael lingered around the house for several days, purportedly waiting to settle some business affairs. Daniel had a tremendous workload at the firm, so he was gone from the morning till late evening. That left Rebecca and Michael alone for several hours, typically sitting around the living room or on the porch, sipping iced tea in the afternoon heat. They discussed everything, including the neighborhood's idiosyncrasies and the dynamic city of Los Angeles, nightlife, former relationships, and anecdotes of Michael's spontaneous climb of Mount Rainier. They had an easy banter. She felt recognized and seen in a way that had been lacking for a long time. Daniel, for his part, noticed that his wife seemed to be in a better mood lately. He did not question it. He imagined she was pleased to have company at her home. He was too preoccupied with his work deadlines to think about it seriously. When he did try to start a conversation during supper, they discussed inconsequential stuff. Rebecca would explain how Michael had helped her replace a broken fence, or accompanied her to the grocery store. Daniel expressed minor satisfaction that she was not alone all day. In his opinion, his brother's presence was a momentary convenience. One evening, Daniel arrived home late and went straight to bed. Rebecca discovered Michael in the garage, digging through old crates. He said he was seeking tools to repair a leak in the guest bathroom. She smiled, eager to think he was genuinely helpful. However, his questions about an old family safe in the corner piqued her interest. The safe belonged to Daniel and Michael's father, who died years ago, leaving just a few scattered items. The battered metal box appeared ancient, and the family had never attempted to open it. Rebecca had no idea if it held anything precious, but Michael seemed strangely fixated on it. He felt the corroded doorknob and inquired if Daniel had ever discussed it. Rebecca shrugged, adding that Daniel never had the time or desire to explore what was inside. The next day, while Daniel was at work and Rebecca was running errands, Michael invited himself to have a closer look at the safe. He spent hours experimenting with the lock, testing previous combinations, and even using a small toolkit to see if he could get it open. He made little progress, but he smiled to himself, as if he enjoyed the struggle. When Rebecca returned, she discovered him scrutinizing the safe, as if it were a conundrum he wanted to solve. She taunted him about his newfound fascination, and he just said that it didn't harm to be curious about what their father had left behind. She let the subject drop. Meanwhile, a slight shift began to occur in Rebecca's thoughts. The silent house grew, with an undercurrent of tension whenever she and Michael were alone. A week following his arrival, they went grocery shopping together, which felt uncomfortably intimate. Walking down aisles loaded with cereal boxes and fresh food, she sensed the stares of passers-by who could have assumed they were a couple. She discovered how simple it was to talk to him, laugh, and make tiny jokes about the stuff for sale in the parking lot. As they carried things into the trunk, he accidentally brushed across her arm. Their gazes held for a heartbeat longer than was acceptable. She experienced a quick flush, a combination of excitement and remorse. She assured herself that it was innocent, yet a sense of foreboding lingered in her mind. That night, she attempted to initiate a moment of closeness with Daniel. She made a light dinner, set a few candles on the dining table, and dressed in a way that she hoped would capture his attention. When Daniel walked in, he appeared fatigued. His tie loosened, and his hair became untidy. He muttered a welcome. When he noticed the candles, he seemed to appreciate the effort. But then his phone vibrated. A colleague called to discuss a time-sensitive settlement agreement. He apologized distractedly to Rebecca, moved away to take the call, and stayed on the phone for nearly 30 minutes. When he returned, the candles had half melted and the supper was cold. Rebecca silently cleared the plates, her disappointment morphing into simmering contempt. Michael witnessed this from the hallway. He volunteered to assist with cleaning up, and she did not object. She was too sad to urge him to leave. She eventually admitted to her loneliness, while scrubbing dishes in the kitchen. Michael listened, drying each plate and putting it away. It was a raw moment, one that pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. She fought to hold back the tears, but they burned at the corners of her eyes. Michael placed a calming touch on her shoulder, and she did not recoil. Instead, she turned toward him, revealing her vulnerability. The moment sat there, full of suspense. They said nothing else, yet neither stepped aside. A rush of conflicting feelings washed over her, a mix of longing and terror at what she might be about to do in another week. The unspoken tension increased. Rebecca and Michael went to a home improvement store together one afternoon. They claimed they were seeking parts to repair a dripping faucet in the guest bathroom. But the real reason was much easier. They both wanted an excuse to go out alone together. They walked down aisles of tools, faucets, and paint materials. Their chat veered into a personal area. Regrets. Dreams. The sense of being stranded in lives that no longer matched what they had envisaged. By the time they exited the store, they could feel an electric charge circulating between them. Michael's hand touched hers briefly on the way back, and she did not draw away. It was a minor betrayal, but in that moment, it felt momentous. A light rain fell in the area that evening. Rebecca and Michael stood on the porch, watching the raindrops hit the pavement. She said that the sound of rain in Los Angeles always felt strange, given the city's regular dryness. He laughed softly and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The world seems to slow down before either of them could contemplate the implications. They kissed. It was a delicate, long kiss that held the weight of suppressed desire and the sting of betrayal. Her thoughts screamed warnings, but her body, desperate for attention, responded enthusiastically. When they parted ways, the guilt erupted. But it also did something that felt strangely like relief for a few days. They tiptoed around each other, silent participants in a deception that became more dangerous with each stolen minute. Rebecca rationalized her actions by blaming Daniel's neglect. Michael appeared torn, but not enough to stop. They exchanged frantic embraces in the hall and muttered confessions late at night. She realized she was losing control, but she couldn't muster the courage to break it off. Meanwhile, Daniel sensed an unidentified shift. He'd catch glimpses of Rebecca and Michael exchanging glances at the dinner table, or how quiet they went when he walked into a room. He told himself he was just overworked and should be happy they were getting along. However, strange suspicions seeped into his dreams. One Saturday, he discovered a text message on Rebecca's phone, which she had left on the kitchen countertop. It was from Michael. A brief message about meeting somewhere to pick up a certain item. The wording was benign, but the tone was strangely intimate. Daniel's gut clenched in knots. He sought to deny the idea that his own brother and wife might be keeping something from him. Michael's phone calls became increasingly mysterious, and he frequently left the house in a hurry, claiming to be managing outstanding business. He occasionally returned with bruises or scratches, muttering explanations about mishaps or scuffles with nearby punks. Rebecca became frightened and pressed him for answers, but he dismissed her questions. Daniel overheard portions of Michael's phone chats about debts and seeing dodgy persons in downtown Los Angeles. There are also urgent financial obligations. The tension surged. Michael, who was once nonchalant and confident, began to show signs of worry, as if an invisible clock was ticking. Rebecca found herself in a difficult situation. Worried about Michael's safety and ashamed of what they were up to behind Daniel's back. Things came to a head one evening when Daniel discovered an unmarked envelope in the mailbox. Inside were photos of Michael seeing a strange man in a back alley near Hollywood Boulevard. The photographs all have date stamps from within the last week. A typed note advised Daniel that Michael owed more than he could ever repay, and that he should be cautious about anyone he trusted. Daniel, horrified, approached Michael at the dinner table, where Rebecca was also present. He wanted explanations. Michael tried to dismiss it, claiming that the photos were part of a smear campaign by former associates. He had cut ties with Daniel and was not sure he believed it. He threatened to kick Michael out until he confessed, but Rebecca stepped in, appealing for calm. They concluded the night in a tense confrontation, with Daniel enraged and Michael withdrawing to his guest room. Rebecca was trembling, hating the thought that her world was collapsing. A few days later, under pressure from whoever he owed money to, Michael intimated to Rebecca that their father's old safe might contain something valuable that could solve all of their problems. He advised opening it just to see what was inside. Rebecca hesitated. She feared telling Daniel, especially after their disagreement. But Michael persisted, offering lovely reassurances in her bewildered state. Wishing to help him, she accepted to be his accomplice. They waited until Daniel arrived at work, before pulling the safe out of the garage and experimenting with various combinations. After several efforts, the lock finally worked. The door creaked open, displaying a stack of yellowed paperwork, faded photographs, and a little velvet pouch within a pouch. They discovered a few tarnished gold coins, presumably from their great-grandfather's inheritance. Michael's eyes glittered. He insisted they could be valuable, perhaps enough to pay off his debts or buy him some time. Rebecca experienced a surge of panic. She recognized they were crossing a line by going through family heirlooms, without Daniel's knowledge. But Michael's desperation swayed her. Later that same night, Daniel discovered the open safe in the garage and recognized what had transpired. Furious, he attacked Rebecca and Michael, wanting to know whether they had stolen anything. They both denied it at first, then Daniel saw the velvet pouch had disappeared. In a heated dispute, Michael ultimately admitted he had it but claimed he needed it to settle a life-threatening debt. The three of them shouted at each other. Daniel felt deceived not just by Michael, but also by his wife, who helped his brother behind his back. Rebecca burst into tears, revealing her perplexity and worry. Daniel threatened to call the police if Michael didn't return the coins right away. That's when Michael snapped, saying that he had no option since dangerous people were present. He stormed away, leaving Daniel and Rebecca shaking. The following day, Daniel discovered an unsettling statement scrawled on a piece of paper attached to the front door. It was a carefully veiled threat, referring to Michael's death and insinuating danger to those close to him. With no other option, Daniel insisted on going to the police, but Michael vanished. Rebecca was divided, scared for Michael's safety and overcome with remorse. She called him often, left messages, and begged him to return. Daniel vacillated between fury and concern, unsure which emotion to trust. Michael called Rebecca late one evening, desperately mumbling that he was holed up in a cheap motel. He encouraged her to come alone. She left without telling Daniel, consumed by the desire to shield Michael from the danger he had unleashed. When she came, she discovered him battered and pacing the dirty room. He grabbed the packet of cash with one hand, as if it were his lifeline. Outside, mysterious creatures waited near the parking lot, probably the debt collectors. Michael begged Rebecca to assist him in devising an escape plan. He insisted on running somewhere other than Los Angeles, perhaps to Vegas. She panicked, divided between loyalty to Daniel and a strange obsession with Michael. As they talked, she heard the faint click of a rifle being primed in the passage outside. The realization of the danger struck her in a fit of dread. She dialed Daniel, who answered on the second ring. She described the Michael issue. Her voice trembles. Daniel, despite his fury at her secret treachery, told her to stay put. He'd arrive with help. She waited on the line until he arrived, accompanied by one of his colleagues, a legal investigator. By the time they arrived, the corridor was empty, but tense words resonated from a neighboring alleyway. Michael had fled outside with the coins, most likely being pursued by his creditors. Rebecca hurried after him. Daniel was worried but also outraged. Followed closely. That was when the scenario shifted back to the present, with Daniel kneeling in the rain-soaked alley, staring at a body on the ground. Michael was shot and barely conscious. Sirens wailed, and red and blue lights flashed over the walls. The men who had been tracking Michael vanished into the night, leaving a trail of destruction. Rebecca stood to the side, immobilized with sadness and shock. Her tears mingled with the rain. Daniel tried to apply pressure to Michael's chest wound, while begging for someone to call an emergency. All around them, the city's heart was beating, distant traffic, flashing headlights, and the sound of helicopters overhead. The police arrived, blanketing the area with torches and protective jackets. They commanded that everyone get down. Daniel raised his hands, stammering that he was unarmed and that his brother was bleeding out. Rebecca dropped to her knees, sobbing, as paramedics pushed past them to reach Michael. The paramedics tried to keep him stable, strapping him to a stretcher and rushing him away. Daniel and Rebecca were held aside for questioning. The investigator in charge asked hurried questions about what had occurred, attempting to solve the unusual mystery of two brothers, a stolen family relic, and an impending tragedy. Over the next few hours, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, the full narrative began to unravel. The detective discovered the little velvet purse among the strewn debris. It held the ancient gold coins. Further inquiry found that Michael had been involved in a bogus real estate transaction that failed, putting him in debt to a ring of dangerous loan sharks. Coins became his desperate last recourse. As the sun arose, Daniel and Rebecca sat on the curb outside the taped-off area. Their marriage and lives are in shambles. She finally revealed to Daniel that she and Michael had become closer than they should have, though she couldn't bring herself to say the entire truth. Nonetheless, the implication hung in the air, as real as the sirens that rang across the streets. Daniel stared blankly, unable to answer. Michael survived his injuries, but he faced charges coming from his illicit activities. Daniel spent the following 3 weeks visiting him in the hospital, a whirlpool of emotions bubbling beneath his cool facade. Rebecca remained at home, dealing with her own guilt. The house felt altered today, reflecting everything that had happened within its walls. She packed a few bags one afternoon, unsure of her destination. She simply couldn't take the accusatory stillness that pervaded every area. Daniel let her leave without saying anything. "I'm still in shock from the whole thing." The legal case eventually unfolded. Michael accepted a plea deal for the illicit activities, and the stolen coins became part of the official record. Daniel confronted the sobering realization that he had nearly lost his life, brother, and marriage in a whirlwind of incompetence and betrayal. Rebecca spoke about Michael's activities, while carefully omitting the painful facts of their personal relationship. Finally, Michael was condemned to prison. He sobbed as he apologized to Daniel for the grief and devastation he had caused, rather than for the debts he had accumulated. Daniel made no response. Rebecca attempted to save what was left of her life by turning away from his heart, which had become too numb to process any form of reconciliation. She found a little apartment a few miles away, and the vivid posters of California beaches on the walls reminded her of how illusions may crumble. Though Daniel considered divorce, legal proceedings took a second seat to the chaos of everything else. He attended necessary sessions at his workplace to explain his unexpected leave of absence and attempted to re-establish a sense of routine. The house was half empty, and the once sturdy furniture felt like it would fall beneath the weight of memories. Time crawled forward. Weeks went by, months passed, and the wheels of justice moved slowly. Daniel was both relieved and saddened when Michael was officially moved to an out-of-state prison. He drove out to see him one final time, hoping to put this tragedy behind him. Michael, gaunt and haunted, gripped Daniel's hand through the bars, muttering that he had never intended for any of this to happen. Daniel merely nodded. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he didn't trust himself to speak. They locked gazes in deep grief before Daniel turned away. In the following, Rebecca phoned Daniel on occasion, leaving voicemails to check on him or ask if he wanted to talk about it. He rarely responded to the calls. Instead, he concentrated on the gradual process of regaining control over his life. He hired a locksmith to protect the old safe. This time, with a new lock and no secrets within. The battered appearance of the box served as a reminder of how minor details from the past can spark disastrous occurrences. On several days, he considered dumping it entirely, but part of him felt it had to stay. It symbolized truth, remembrance, and the durability of choices. Months later, Daniel found himself in the living room, going through old papers and deciding what to keep and put away. He stumbled upon a snapshot of himself and Rebecca from their honeymoon in Hawaii. They seemed very joyful and young. He gingerly placed it in a box titled Memories, unsure if the agony would ever go away. He turned to see the safe half hidden behind a stack of cartons. In a moment of irony, he understood that, for all the upheaval it had caused, it was only an object, a quiet witness to greed, secrets, and heartache. He drove to a county office one afternoon, slipping past the metal detectors and the board security personnel. He dropped off divorce papers that he had been dreading for weeks. He felt a strange combination of finality and comfort. Some stories conclude with a grave or irreversible loss. Others loiter, leaving the door open to regrets. Daniel's agonizing acceptance of his wife's betrayal and his brother's collapse was sufficient to end this chapter of his life. He stepped outside into the brilliant Los Angeles sunlight and took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever came next. A short time later, a box came at Daniel's doorstep. It came from the police evidence locker, which contained numerous objects recovered on the night of the shooting. Among them was the small velvet purse, now empty, with the contents seized by the authorities or sold to satisfy a portion of the debts. He turned it over in his fingers, noting how small it seemed without the gold coins. He set it on a table, wondering if this was the ultimate sign that all was over, or if something from the past would haunt him in the future. Rebecca never moved back in. Michael spent his days in prison, anticipating possible parole. Daniel continued to work at the law business, earning the trust of his colleagues and discreetly establishing a new life. He would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, remembering the rain-soaked alley and the deafening police sirens. Sometimes his nightmares would include pictures of Rebecca and Michael in shadows, conversing gently and shutting him out. He would shake off the dreams, assuring himself that they were part of a life he could never totally escape, but was resolved to put behind. The tabloids printed a brief story about the assassination attempt, tied to criminal debts, but interest quickly waned. Los Angeles, always full of scandals and dramatic stories, moved on to the next headline. Life in the city continued as usual. Beaches remained busy, roadways clogged, and neon signs flashed above late-night cafes. Daniel realized that in a metropolis, this massive personal tragedy was simply another thread in the tapestry, easily overshadowed by the constant churn of new drama. Weeks later, sitting alone at his kitchen table, Daniel drank coffee while thumbing through a stack of mail, bills, advertising, and a postcard from an old college acquaintance. He had nearly completed sorting when he discovered an envelope from the county court. most likely an official confirmation of his divorce file. He opened it. The official tone, the clerk's signature, and the legal vocabulary all indicated that his marriage had effectively ended. He set it on the counter, took a deep breath, and reminded himself that the hardest part was already behind him. He considered the main characters in his story, his brother in a jail cell, his wife someplace in Los Angeles or beyond, and himself, a man left to rebuild a life that previously felt so solid. Despite the devastation, he gained a dismal sense of clarity. Choices have repercussions, and ignoring minor flaws may eventually destroy the entire edifice. In the end, he wasn't sure whether he should pity or despise Michael, love or hate Rebecca, or simply forgive himself for not recognizing the clues sooner. He proceeded to the garage and turned on the lights. His eyes lingered on the safe, which was now secured with a new combination and free of anything that could cause further difficulties. Part of him wanted to get rid of it, while another saw it as a symbol. Perhaps he will eventually donate it or put it on the curb. For the time being, it served as a reminder of the difference between trust and treachery. Life in Los Angeles went on by day. Daniel navigated the city's judicial system, representing clients in corporate issues, occasionally checking the clock and noting how swiftly the hours passed. By nightfall, he'd established new routines, such as jogging along the beach or meeting colleagues for a casual drink at a bar on Sunset Boulevard. He avoided relationships for a while, unsure whether he could ever be close to anyone again. Yet with each passing day, he felt less burdened by the past. Rebecca, on the other hand, spread stories among common acquaintances that she had landed a job as a receptionist at a real estate company. She rarely contacted Daniel, and when she did, he often ignored her messages. Perhaps she was trying to make apologies or simply get rid of her own guilt. Michael wrote letters while incarcerated, but Daniel rarely read them. It was too early. Perhaps one day he will find it in his heart to read and answer. But he hadn't arrived yet. When Daniel went through downtown, seeing the courthouse or catching a glimpse of the Hollywood sign in the distance, he wondered if everything had actually transpired. The memory of that alley on a rainy night seemed strange. Now, the city was bustling with activity, with horns honking and people racing everywhere, their personal tragedies creating an endless tapestry. He recognized that his tragic entanglement was simply one of millions of stories. But for him, it was an earthquake that shattered all he thought he knew. Nightfall in Los Angeles brought back a kaleidoscope of neon colors and loud music from clubs, bars, and late-night restaurants. Daniel would occasionally stand on his balcony, watching headlights race along the expressway. Each one represents a person's hopes, secrets, and heartache. The more he looked at that picture, the more he realized that darkness and light were in perpetual motion. In quiet moments, he wondered if Rebecca had ever looked at the same skyline and felt the same need and sadness. He wondered if Michael, in his prison cell, felt any sorrow that went beyond terror for his own skin. Daniel's imagination would wander over all conceivable possibilities in the silence of the night, such as a timeline in which his brother was not involved in shady deals, or one in which his wife confided in him before things worsened. But different universes provided little relief. He recognized the futility of concentrating on what could have been, and instead focused on what remained. Weeks merged into months. Daniel finally found Michael's letters, while rummaging through a drawer full of envelopes. They remained unopened, but his fingers hesitated over them, unsure whether to open them or throw them away. He placed them aside after a brief moment of thinking. He needed more time, but he did not waste it. Soon after, he had to drive past the motel where things had come to a head. The structure appeared as dismal as ever. Paint is peeling, and the windows are cracked. That night, he remembered his brother lying in the rain. There is blood on the pavement, sirens screech. But this time, the memory was more distant, like a faded snapshot. He came to a halt at a nearby red light, took a deep breath, and felt both the weight of sorrow and the faintest stirring of acceptance. The light turned green, and he continued on. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. The documents came to his home, with an official seal marking the conclusion of the One Life chapter. He left them unopened on the table for a few hours, carrying on with his usual routine as if nothing had happened. Later, with a silent determination, he opened the envelope, read the legal jargon, and placed the final papers in the same box as the old photographs. Perhaps he would return to them eventually, or perhaps he would let them collect dust. Life discovered a new equilibrium. Daniel resumed his law profession full-time, winning a few big cases and gaining accolades from partners. He gradually socialized more, meeting pals for lunch in Beverly Hills or taking a stroll through the Fairfax Farmers Market. The city's vitality began to feel energizing rather than oppressive. He even returned to the beach, letting the ocean breeze wash over him. He wasn't stupid enough to think he was completely cured. but he found satisfaction in the minor pleasures that life still provided. On a brisk evening, he decided to clean out the garage completely. He opened the safe one last time to ensure that it was indeed empty, except for a few dusty documents. Then he carried it to the curb, leaving it for anyone looking for scrap metal or the opportunity to repurpose the battered box. He felt no regret, just a sense of relief. He closed the garage door and switched off the lights as he headed back inside. Daniel felt a gentle gust of wind rustle across the suburban street, sweeping away the final traces of a story that had permanently altered him. The contours of his previous existence had vanished, replaced by unclear new possibilities. Nonetheless, he was no longer afraid of the unknown. It merely reminded him that every day in a city like Los Angeles provided an opportunity to start over, or at least to continue a little wiser than before. Though he never received a precise explanation for why things went so wrong, Daniel came to recognize that people might crumble under the weight of unfulfilled expectations, that trust may crumble in the face of secrets, and that love can transform into something unrecognizable if left unattended for too long. A wet night in the alley, a bullet that almost wounded Michael, and the disintegration of a once promising marriage. Everything became part of his tapestry. Time marched on in that enormous American city of freeways and hopes. Daniel would occasionally ponder on the shattered remnants of his previous life, but these thoughts no longer paralyzed him. They served as reminders that everything is fragile, including marriage, brotherhood, and security. However, with that fragility came a fresh drive to be watchful, to spot warning signals before they turned into disasters. In a city where the skyline was ablaze with ambition, and the streets were teeming with hustlers, illusions may vanish in a flash. He promised himself he would not remain bitter. Whatever his future held, the lessons he acquired on that risky journey would mold it. Lessons on attention, affection, and the consequences of neglect. The final recollection he had of the incident was not the blood or the sirens, but the sensation of the first raindrops on that porch night. The silence before his life changed forever. It was a reminder that beneath any seemingly tranquil surface, a storm could be brewing, ready to unleash its fury. All one could do was keep an eye on the clouds, be open to the chance of seeing sunlight, and never dismiss the distant rumblings of thunder.